Was it murder? Joining our discussion now is Melissa Murray, a law professor at New York University. She's a former law clerk to Judge Sonia Sotomayor when she was on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. She's also an MSNBC contributor. Also joining our discussion, Judith Browne Dianis, Executive Director of the National Office of the Advancement Project. And Melissa Murray, I just want to give you an open field for your reaction to today's testimony.
It was another visceral day of testimony. If yesterday the prosecution created a skeleton using the video from that fateful day, today they began layering flesh onto that skeleton by providing these visceral accounts from eyewitnesses who watched Mr. Floyd and watched the interaction between him and Officer Chauvin. And it was incredibly powerful testimony. We heard yet again another witness say that they were so distressed and disturbed by what they were witnessing that they felt compelled to call the police on the police. We saw a first responder say that this was completely beyond the pale, that in other first responder situations, they would have given the individual medical treatment, but instead what we saw here was Officer Chauvin continuing to persist with his line with Mr. Floyd. And again, all of this, I think, leaves a question for the defense as they prepare to mount their defense of Officer Chauvin. Does it make sense to have Officer Chauvin take the stand in his own defense? He's not required to do so, certainly, but perhaps it would help to humanize him and to, again, give the jurors an idea of what he was thinking during that moment, what his thinking was, why he decided to act in the way he did, and to perhaps inject a humanizing element that would make him more palatable to the jurors going forward.
Judith Dianis, I have been marveling at Darnella Frazier since her video first emerged, and I began talking about her on this program from the first night that video emerged. Before we knew her name the second night, and that strength and that purpose that she showed by just holding that camera on this scene for the entire time. And I'd always wondered, how did she feel during that? Did she feel threatened? We discovered today in her testimony that, yes, she did feel threatened. She felt threatened specifically from Derek Chauvin, but she still held her spot and held that camera. And it is thanks to what she did that we're watching this trial today.
That's right. You hit it on the nail on the head, because she was very brave by doing this. I mean, here we see the police murdering someone in daylight, that there are witnesses who are not just bystanders not getting involved, but trying to intervene. I have a daughter who's the same age, and I just cannot imagine the trauma of that moment. But to keep that camera fixed on the police officers who are killing George Floyd. And so her video changes everything. Her testimony was heartbreaking. To hear her talk about the fact that she feels guilty, that she didn't do more. The EMT worker saying she feels guilty because she wanted to intervene, but the police kept them at bay. And so really everything that we heard today also undermines whether or not there was reasonable force. The other thing that we know is that for Black people, when we see something like this, we know that the police do not keep us safe. And who are you going to call to police the police?
Melissa Murray, we know from the defense opening statement that all of this testimony that we're hearing now is going to be discarded by them in the final argument that they present to the jury, because their case is going to be entirely about cause of death as determined by the medical examiner's report, and they are going to insist that the cause of death was not the knee on George Floyd's neck.
No, that's certainly the case. The prosecution has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Chauvin's conduct was a substantial cause of George Floyd's death. All the defense has to do is inject reasonable doubt that, in fact, there were other pre-existing factors or intervening factors that could also have contributed to George Floyd's death. It doesn't necessarily mean that the prosecution will not be successful. They just have to establish beyond a reasonable doubt that it was a substantial cause. But we are going to see over the course of the defense's case more medical testimony, more discussion of Mr. Floyd, his history, that past arrest from 2019. all in the service of showing that Officer Chauvin was not the main cause. And we'll also hear more about Officer Chauvin acting within the scope of his discretion as a police officer.
Judith Dianis, does it hurt the defense that so far, certainly from their opening statement, they are going to insist that Derek Chauvin actually did everything right? After today's testimony, and you hear Darnella Frazier say, we all knew it wasn't right. Clearly, everyone in that courtroom today knows that it wasn't right. It's a different question as to whether it was murder. But Derek Chauvin's defense is not even allowing for the possibility that anything he did wasn't right.
Well, I think technically what it's not going to come down to is whether or not it was right or not. It's going to come down to whether or not it was reasonable and was he trained to do this. And so the defense will put on witnesses saying that he complied with the training that he had. And what we need to understand is that if he was trained to actually do that, then that goes to show that policing is all wrong and that we have a lot of work to do to change the standards of excessive use of force.
Professor Melissa Maury and Judith Browne Dianis, thank you very much for starting off our discussion tonight. A painful discussion, but we appreciate your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you. And coming up, Congressman Matt Gaetz attacked Congressman Ted Lieu tonight while trying to defend himself against a New York Times report that he is being investigated for possible sex crime.